They called her the old woman in the old airplane. Not to her face, never to her face. But on the flight line, in the mess hall, in the quiet corners of the briefing room where junior pilots gathered after the day's sorties were logged and the debrief coffee had gone cold, the name circulated with the easy cruelty of people who have never been tested by the thing they are dismissing. The aircraft was an A-10 Thunderbolt II. It sat at the far end of the apron like something the base had forgotten to throw away. Its paint was the flat gray of an overcast January sky, and it wore the subtle dents and repairs of a machine that had been somewhere real. Not the pristine gray of an aircraft that spent its career doing training runs over safe ground. The kind of gray that accumulates when metal meets shrapnel and survives. She had arrived at the wing on a Tuesday, which nobody remembers, in weather nobody remembers, from a posting nobody at this base had thought to ask about. She checked in at personnel, drew her bunk assignment, ate alone in the far corner of the officers' mess, and was on the flight line before first light the following morning, doing a pre-flight walk-around that the crew chiefs had already completed. She did not ask them to do it again. She simply did it herself, her gloved hands moving over the airframe with the deliberate patience of someone who has learned, at some altitude and some cost, that pre-flight checks are the one ritual you never delegate. Her name was Major Claire Holt. Nobody called her that yet. They did not know her name yet, not really. She was just the woman who flew the Warthog. The fast jet lieutenants had a name for her aircraft. They called it the Crypt Keeper. The joke being that the A-10 was a dead platform, obsolete, a relic of a Cold War doctrine that precision munitions and unmanned systems had made irrelevant. They were not entirely wrong about the doctrine debates. They were entirely wrong about the aircraft, and they were entirely wrong about the woman who flew it. But they would not discover that for another 3 weeks. She moved through the wing like furniture, present, necessary in some abstract institutional sense, but not noticed. She was of medium height and moved economically, with none of the physical display that young pilots sometimes use to announce themselves in a new posting. Her uniform was worn but immaculate. She had a habit of carrying a small notebook that she wrote in after every sortie, and she had a habit of not speaking in meetings unless she had something specific to say. Both habits struck people as slightly odd. Senior Master Sergeant Ray Okafor noticed her on the 3rd day. He was the senior maintainer for the A-10 section, a man who had been turning wrenches on warthogs longer than most of the lieutenants at this base had been alive, and he noticed things about pilots the way a craftsman notices things about the people who handle his work. He noticed the way she touched the aircraft, the way a hand rested briefly on the left engine nacelle, not inspecting, not checking, just resting, the gesture of someone who has been far from home with this particular machine and is quietly glad to be back. He did not say anything. He filed it, in the way that experienced men file things that do not yet have a category. The flight operations officer was a lieutenant colonel named Brandt. He was the kind of officer who had built his career in an era when certain types of platforms attracted certain types of ambitious, connected pilots, and who regarded the A-10 section with the tolerant disinterest of someone managing a legacy budget line. He was not cruel. He was indifferent, which in the particular way it expressed itself toward Major Holt, landed with the same weight. In the weekly operations meeting, he referred to the A-10 section's tasking as the slow lane. He said it with a small, self-satisfied smile, and the junior officers around the table laughed with the mechanical cheerfulness of people who understand hierarchy. Major Holt was in the room. She wrote something in her notebook. She did not look up. If you believe that quiet competence is more dangerous than anything that announces itself, type the word competence in the comments below. What happened on the night of the 14th would not have happened the way it happened if 4 things had not been true simultaneously. The first was that a 12-person ground element had been inserted into the mountain corridor at dusk, moving toward an objective that the intelligence picture showed as lightly defended. The intelligence picture was wrong in the way that intelligence pictures sometimes are, selectively, consequentially, and too late. The second was that the weather over the corridor had come down fast, below minimums for the fixed-wing platforms that would normally have been first on the scramble list. The F-16s were grounded. The two other A-10s on the base were grounded, one with a hydraulic fault and one with its pilot already past his crew rest limit. The helicopters were grounded. The operations center was running out of viable assets in the order of preference that doctrine prescribed. The third was that the ground element, having made contact with a force 3 times the size of the intelligence estimate, had taken 2 casualties and gone to ground in a shallow draw 6 kilometers short of the objective, with effective fire coming from 2 ridgelines and their extraction route compromised. The fourth was that Major Claire Holt had filed no crew rest violation, had no maintenance discrepancy on her aircraft, and was standing on the flight line at the moment the duty officer's radio traffic indicated what was happening in the mountains, because she had come out to check something on the left main gear assembly, because she always checked something when she could not sleep, and she had not been sleeping well since arriving at this posting. She listened to the radio traffic for 40 seconds. Then she walked to her aircraft. Sergeant Okafor was the only person on the flight line. He watched her begin her start sequence and came over at something between a walk and a run, his face careful. She looked at him through the canopy as the first engine came up. He read her face and stepped back, not because he was ordered to, because he recognized something in her expression that told him, without words, that this had already been decided by someone with more authority over the situation than either of them. The Warthog rolled. It did not pause at the hold short line with the hesitation of a crew waiting for clearance. It paused for exactly the duration required by procedure, and then it moved, because procedure said the pause was about safety and not about permission, and she knew the difference between the two. The tower came on the radio. She said 2 words. She said, "Rescue flight." Then she was gone into the dark. What happened in the mountain corridor over the next 31 minutes was not recorded in any official sequence that existed in accessible files at this base. The ground element's radio operator kept a log, because ground element radio operators keep logs regardless of what is happening around them, because that is what they are trained to do, and because sometimes the log is the only thing that survives. The log noted the first radio contact at 23:14. The voice was calm, female, and gave a call sign that the radio operator did not recognize, but that the element's team sergeant did. He recognized the call sign the way you recognize something from a long time ago, something you heard in a different context, at a different altitude, and you cannot immediately place it, but the sound of it does something specific to your chest. The team sergeant got on the radio and gave grid coordinates. The voice said, "Copy all, 2 minutes." Then the cannon sound started. The GAU-8 rotary cannon, mounted in the nose of the A-10, fires 30mm depleted uranium rounds at approximately 3,900 rounds per minute. This is not a sound that resembles any other sound. It is not a rattle or a roar. It is a tearing, a prolonged tearing of something very large, and it has a physical component that travels through the ground and through walls and through the chest cavity of anyone within several hundred meters of the impact. On the northern ridgeline, the fire that had been systematically working down toward the draw stopped. It stopped with the abruptness of a switched light. She made 4 passes on the northern ridgeline in the first 6 minutes. The aircraft was taking fire on the second pass. The A-10 is the only American combat aircraft specifically designed to absorb punishment and continue flying. Its cockpit is enclosed in a titanium bathtub, a shell capable of withstanding direct hits from rounds up to 23 millimeters. Its hydraulic and control systems are redundant, designed to function on backup systems when the primary takes damage. Its engines are placed high and wide to separate them from each other, so that one engine's catastrophic failure does not destroy the other. The designers of this aircraft in the 1970s assumed it would fly in exactly the kind of environment where people would be trying very hard to bring it down, and they built it accordingly. On the third pass, a surface-to-air missile detonated close enough to crack the left side of her canopy. She continued the pass. The ground element's radio operator noted, in the log, at 23:19, CAS aircraft sustained what appears to be canopy damage. Continued gun run. Pilot made no radio mention of damage. He underlined the last sentence, not for emphasis. He underlined it because he found it notable, the same way you note in writing something that you want to remember accurately because you know you will not believe it the same way later. If these stories mean something to you, the link to support the channel on Patreon is right there in the description. Now, back to the mountains. On the southern ridgeline, the second fire position had shifted, moved laterally to acquire a better angle on the draw where the ground element was sheltering. This is called fire and movement, and it is what trained personnel do when they are being engaged from the air, and the people on the southern ridgeline were trained. They moved, and she moved with them, because she could see the heat signatures through the targeting pod on the aircraft's nose, and because tracking a moving ground element in broken terrain at low altitude in the dark is a skill that takes specific hours to acquire, and she had those hours. The southern ridgeline went quiet at 23:31. The ground elements team sergeant said, on the radio, in a voice that was doing its best to stay professional, "Ridgelines clear. Extraction route open. We have 2 urgent and 1 priority. Can you hold the valley?" She said, "Until you're gone." She held the valley for an additional 9 minutes. The extraction helicopters arrived at 23:40. She remained on station until the last helicopter was out of the corridor, flying slow circles in the dark above a valley she had just emptied of threat, the cracked canopy letting in air cold enough to be felt through the oxygen mask, the aircraft carrying damage that would not be fully inventoried until morning. She set the aircraft down at 23:58. She taxied to the A-10 section. She shut down. Sergeant Okafor was waiting with a ladder and a flashlight. She climbed down. She looked at him and said, "Left main hydraulic is going to need attention." Then she walked toward the operations center, because there were communications to log, because there was always paperwork after a mission, and because she had been doing this long enough to know that the paperwork did not wait for morning just because the mission had been conducted in the middle of the night. The damage assessment began at first light. Sergeant Okafor had been an aircraft maintainer for 22 years. In those 22 years, he had seen aircraft come back from bad days. He had seen aircraft come back from days that made other maintainers go quiet. He had not seen an aircraft come back from a night like this one and be taxied by its pilot to a parking spot and shut down in the normal sequence, as though the walk back across the apron were just a walk, and not the walk of someone who had just held a mountain corridor alone for 31 minutes while the mountain corridor tried to disagree. He began at the canopy. The crack ran from the upper left corner, diagonally across 40% of the transparency. Behind a crack like that, on a night like last night, in air that cold, at those altitudes, the pilot would have been breathing ambient air through the mask at whatever temperature the outside world offered, with the wind from the slipstream entering at every bank angle above a certain degree. He photographed the crack. He wrote the measurement in his log. He moved to the airframe. The aircraft had been hit. The maintainer's term is battle damage, and it has a specificity to it that the layman's term does not. Battle damage is not a metaphor. It is a hole, or a dent, or a burn mark at a location on an airframe where the physics of a projectile intersect with the physics of aluminum and titanium, and the record of that intersection is precise, measurable, and classified in degrees of severity. He counted 11 distinct impact points on the left wing root, the belly, the left engine nacelle, and the rear fuselage. 3 of them were significant enough to require depot-level repair. He did not stop. He moved inside the cockpit to begin the interior inspection, and it was there, running his flashlight along the left console panel in the methodical way of a man who has been inside 1,000 cockpits and knows every surface of this one, that he found the marks. He almost missed them. They were small. They were precise. They had been made with something thin and sharp, a blade or possibly a coin edge into the interior surface of the left console panel, in the narrow space between the fuel management subpanel and the lower edge of the radar altimeter display. The panel was black. The marks were fine lines in the black, catching the flashlight at exactly the right angle. He counted them twice. He sat in the seat, in the empty cockpit of the aircraft, and he counted them again. 43. 43 small, neat tally marks, cut in groups of 5 in the traditional way, with the 5th mark crossing the previous 4 diagonally. Not recent. The wear of the surrounding paint and the oxidation at the edges of the cuts told him the oldest marks had been there for years. Ray Okafor sat in that cockpit for a long time. He was 51 years old. He had maintained A-10s for 22 of those years, at 4 different bases, through 3 different unit assignments and 2 combat deployments. He had maintained other aircraft before that. He had been, in the early part of his career, a maintainer for a unit at a base he was not permitted to name, servicing aircraft for missions that had no filed plans and no public acknowledgement. And he had, on one occasion, found marks like these in the cockpit of an aircraft that had come back from a mission that officially never happened. He had not thought about those marks in years. He climbed down from the cockpit. He found his phone in his breast pocket and he called the senior operations officer, not the day officer, not the duty NCO. He called the number at the top of the operations section hierarchy, and he waited while it rang 4 times, and a tired voice answered, and he said, in the flat, uninflected voice of a man who has learned to communicate critical information without editorializing, "Sir, you need to come to the A-10 section. I need you to bring Major Holt's personnel file." There was a silence on the other end of the line. Her file from her previous posting. Another silence. "All of them, sir." Lieutenant Colonel Brandt arrived at the A-10 section 40 minutes later, in his flight suit and with the expression of a man who had been awake since the radio traffic started at 23 o'clock and had spent the intervening hours in the operations center trying to reconstruct what had happened and how to report it. He had the file under his arm. He had the expression of a man who had opened the file in the car on the way over, which he had, and who was still processing what he had read, which he was. He stood at the ladder to the cockpit. Sergeant Okafor gestured. He climbed up. He looked at the console panel with the flashlight that Okafor handed him. He counted the marks. He sat there for a moment with the flashlight in his hand, and then he climbed back down, and when he looked at Sergeant Okafor, something had changed in his face. The tolerance had gone out of it. The professional distance had gone out of it. What was left was something simpler and older, a recognition, and with the recognition, a weight. "How long has she been here?" Brandt said. 3 weeks, sir." "Who does she eat with?" Okafor looked at him. "Nobody," Okafor said. "She eats alone." Brandt stood on the apron in the early morning light and looked at the aircraft with its cracked canopy and its 11 impact points and its 43 unmarked marks, and he did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I need to make some calls." What those calls established, which Lieutenant Colonel Brandt then read aloud in the Operations Section conference room at 0830 to an audience that included every pilot on the base and the 2 crew chiefs who had been assigned to the A-10 section and who had laughed 3 weeks ago about the Crypt Keeper, was the following. Major Claire Holt, United States Air Force, pilot, A-10 Thunderbolt II, time and type, 4,211 hours, combat hours, 1,847. Previous assignments, classified, 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 and then one that was not classified because it had been declassified the previous year as part of a congressional review, which was a joint task force support role in a theater that Brandt named aloud, and 3 of the pilots in the room made small involuntary sounds when they heard it. Decorations. He read them in order. The Silver Star, 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, the Air Medal with 12 oak leaf clusters, the Purple Heart, and then a unit citation for a particular engagement in a mountain corridor in a particular country in a particular year. The citation worded with the careful restraint of official language, trying to describe something that official language was not designed to describe, which was 40 minutes of single-ship close air support for a surrounded ground element conducted in instrument meteorological conditions with battle damage sustained from the second pass onward that had resulted in the extraction of 11 personnel with no further casualties. Someone in the room said, very quietly, that was her. Nobody asked what he meant. The people in the room who knew what engagement the citation described knew what he meant, and the people who did not know knew that they were in the presence of something they should be quiet about. Brandt set the file down on the table. He looked at the room. Major Holt was eating alone in the corner of the mess 3 weeks ago, he said. She has been eating alone since she arrived. I'd like that to stop. He paused. That is not an order. It is an observation. He picked up the file and left. The room was quiet for a long time after he left. One of the fast jet lieutenants who had, 3 weeks ago, used the term Crypt Keeper in the context of Major Holt's aircraft, sat in his chair and looked at the surface of the table. He did not speak. He had the expression of a person recataloguing a very large portion of their recent past. Sergeant Okafor, who had been standing at the back of the room with his notebook and his flashlight still in his breast pocket, left without speaking. He walked back to the A-10 section. He began making the maintenance log entries for the battle damage. It took him 3 hours. When he was finished, he sat for a moment on the maintenance stand next to the aircraft and looked at it. Then he took a grease pencil from his pocket, climbed the ladder, leaned into the cockpit, and made a mark on the console panel, next to the 43 that were already there. Not a tally mark, just a line to show that someone had been here, that someone had looked and seen. He climbed back down. He put the grease pencil away. He went back to work. What happened to the lieutenants who had used that name for her aircraft was not dramatic. There was no confrontation. There was no formal reprimand. There was something quieter and more durable, which is the recognition, within a closed community, of a mistake in judgment that cannot be walked back. The name was never used again. The silence where it used to be was loud enough. The flight operations schedules changed without formal announcement. Major Holt began appearing in the primary tasking column for complex support sorties, not the legacy budget line sorties that Brandt had assigned her to in the first weeks. Nobody said anything about the change. It simply happened, with the quiet efficiency of a correction. She did not acknowledge the change either. She flew the sorties. She wrote in her notebook. She checked her aircraft. She did not begin eating in the main officer's mess. She ate where she ate, which was the far corner where she had always eaten. But after the second week following the conference room briefing, she was not always alone there. Sergeant Okafor began bringing his coffee to that corner on the mornings when his shift timing aligned with her mealtime. He did not ask permission. He simply appeared, sat down, and drank his coffee, and she looked at him once with the evaluating look of someone taking a measurement, and then she went back to her meal, and after that the corner had 2 people in it on certain mornings. The team sergeant from the ground element, whose name was Vargas, and who had done 2 previous combat deployments, and who was not a person given to formal gesture, submitted a request through channels for a copy of Major Holt's call sign from the night of the 14th. The request was an unusual one. He received the call sign. He had it stenciled, very small, on the inside cover of his team's radio log, where it joined other notations that had accumulated over years of the log's service. Grid coordinates of places survived, call signs of people who had come when called. The story spread through the wing the way these stories always spread, which is quietly and completely, the way water finds every level. The version that the junior pilots carried forward was accurate in its essentials and had the virtue of a story that does not require embellishment. She was flying alone, in the dark, in weather, with a cracked canopy, for 31 minutes, without mentioning on the radio that any of this was happening. The version told to incoming pilots at this base in the following months, when they arrived at their assignment and were shown the flight line and the aircraft, and the woman who flew the Warthog at the end of the apron, was brief. It was told by whoever was showing them around, in a low voice, sometimes while she was visible in the middle distance doing her pre-flight walk-around. It went like this. She does not talk about where she flew before. She is going to seem like furniture for the first few weeks. She is the most experienced combat pilot at this posting, and possibly at this command. If you are on the ground in a bad place and the radio crackles at night with a voice you don't recognize, that might be her. If it is her, you are going to be all right. Do not call her aircraft the Crypt Keeper. There is an explanation for why not, and you will hear it eventually, and when you do, you will understand without being told why that is not a thing you say. A new lieutenant, upon hearing this briefing on his second day at the wing, asked the sensible question. He asked what the 43 marks meant. The pilot doing the briefing was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We don't know exactly what each one means. We know what they add up to. We know that there are 43 of them. We know that after last Tuesday, there are 44. The lieutenant thought about this. He looked out at the far end of the apron. "Has anyone asked her?" he said. "No. Why not?" The pilot looked at him with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to someone intelligent. "Because she already answered the question," he said. "She answered it 31 minutes at a time. In the dark, alone. You don't ask someone to explain that. You just make sure you remember it." The new lieutenant stood on the edge of the flight line and watched the Warthog at the far end of the apron, and he thought about 43 marks cut into a console panel in a place where no inspection would find them unless you were looking. He thought about what a person has to do, and where they have to go, and what they have to survive, to make a mark like that and then file it quietly under a paint surface and never mention it. He thought, "I have never been sure, before today, of what it means to be dangerous. Now I have a definition." The Warthog sat at the end of the apron, in the flat gray light, worn and exact, carrying its 44 marks and its cracked canopy and its 4,000 hours of someone's accumulated silence. It looked like a relic. It looked like something the base had forgotten to throw away. It was the most capable aircraft on the base. So was the woman who flew it. Nobody who had been there 3 weeks ago would have told you otherwise now. And the ones who had been saying it before that, quietly, in the corners of briefing rooms and mess halls, had stopped saying it with the thoroughness of people who have realized that the thing they were dismissing was the thing they most needed to pay attention to. Assumptions are the enemy. Competence is the only currency that matters. And the most dangerous person in any room is almost always the one who has never once needed to announce it. For more stories where quiet competence humbles loud arrogance, subscribe to Old Bill's Tales. And if you would like to help me keep telling them, you will find my Patreon linked right there in the description below. Thank you for standing with me.